Are the traditional firearm safety rules still relevant? I'll give you my thoughts on today's Tactical Tidbits. Herman from Alpha One here, guys. Whatever medium you're watching this on, please remember to like, follow, subscribe, but most importantly, share this video so that we can help as many people as possible with this information. All right, so since I'll be addressing a lot of firearms related topics in this series, I thought that it would be prudent to go over the firearm safety rules. After all, this is the first thing that we do every class, every single time without exception. I know that this isn't a very sexy topic and you might think that it would make for a boring video, especially if you're a lifelong shooter and have these safety rules banked into your head a million times. But if you ask me, there's no such thing as being too safe. And I never scoff at going over safety in any class, whether I'm a student or an instructor. And even though I've been handling firearms for over 30 years. And don't worry, I promise that you'll get a few very important takeaways from this episode, and even if you're an experienced shooter, okay? And I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about safety while also reinforcing the importance of mindset and giving you a glimpse into some interesting training concepts and approaches that I employ in my classes. Starting with this one. In training, there's only one absolute: safety. Outside of safety, the things we learn and how we learn them are all open to scrutiny and change. If something can be done more effectively or efficiently, we should be open to exploring it and should not be dogmatic about doing something just because, that's how we've always done it. Typical, right? But I'll reiterate that the only thing that we should be absolutist about is safety, all right? So let's begin with the traditional 4 firearm safety rules. Most of you have come across these or some version of them at some point. Okay, number 1, treat all guns as if they're loaded. Number 2, never point a gun at anything you're not willing to destroy. Number 3, don't put your finger on the trigger until ready to fire. And the last one, be aware of your target and what's beyond it. Now, I'm sure I didn't blow anyone's mind with these rules. They seem like common sense, and you've probably heard them from your grandpa since you were a kid, right? So what's my version of these rules? Well, they're pretty much the same. The only thing that is different is the wording. So consider, 1, all guns are always loaded. Now here we have an opportunity to revisit mindset briefly. Note that the traditional rule states to treat all guns as if they're loaded. This leaves a lot of wiggle room because it implies that sometimes they won't be. If we want to have a mindset of safety, we don't want to have any room for error here. So that's why the version I teach is all guns are always loaded. This flips the switch in our minds so that we get in the proper mindset, which will then ensure that we will follow the other 3 rules. And that brings me to the next topic, which applies to the next 2 rules. As someone who's been training for decades, both in the business world and the personal defense world, one of the lessons you learn, usually the hard way, is just how important word choice is when trying to impart knowledge or information to others. Specifically, the difference between using positive language versus negative or passive language. Let me explain what I mean. Studies have shown that comprehension can drop by as much as 50% for every negative used in a sentence, such as no or don't or never, right? Compared to a positive version. Think of how convoluted the phrase, he didn't not want to go is, right? What it really means is he wanted to go. Moreover, when we're trying to teach something as important as safety, there is little to no wiggle room. A positive statement provides a more rigid path. For instance, let's say that I give you the negative command that you can't drive a Toyota. That only limits you by one brand. You can still drive a Ford, a GM, Honda, BMW, etc. But if I said that you must drive a Toyota, then I've limited you only to one brand, okay? So similarly, if we want to instill important and strict guidelines, who are better served by only stating what they can or must do as opposed to what they should never do. Are you tracking? So how does this apply to the next two safety rules? Well, the second one I teach as always point the gun in a safe direction. Again, I'm using positive language, and in this case, it forces you to actively think about what a safe direction actually means. This will change depending on your setting, such as indoor range and outdoor range, your home, out in the wilderness, etc. And then we take rule number 3. Keep your finger straight and against the frame of the gun until you're on target and ready to fire. Now this one has crucial differences in that the other version merely states to not put your finger on the trigger. Again, negative language. But there are other bad habits that one can develop that can be potentially as dangerous, even though technically your finger is not on the trigger. The most common example that I've seen, and personally, the one I've seen personally, the biggest culprit in negligent discharges is keeping the finger just outside the trigger guard, but curved, like this. A hooked finger is just waiting to find something to hook on. And it doesn't take much for it to find a home on the trigger unwillingly. And it takes even less for it, you to be startled, if you're familiar with the cross extensor chain, if you're doing something with your support hand, especially pushing, for you to contract, the muscles in your gun hand unwittingly. All right, does that make sense? Very, very common. Now, the other crucial aspect of this rule is that I state two very clear conditions that need to be met before moving your finger onto the trigger: being on target and ready to fire. One can be on target and not ready to fire, or ready to fire and not on target. Okay, this is a much narrower and safer guideline than the older version, which takes us to the last rule, number 4. Be aware of your surroundings. This is a perfect way to bookend the rules with another one that is more about mindset, such as the first one. Instead of simply calling to be aware of our target and what lies beyond, general situational awareness is what we need to have, not just in the range, but out in the real world, especially if we find ourselves having to use a firearm to protect ourselves. In the real world, there are few, if any, 100% safe directions or targets to shoot at. I would rather get someone focused about being aware of their surroundings as a whole, downrange, background, foreground, the firing line, instructor, fellow students around them, and risk them getting complacent from always shooting in a setting that has backstops and very strict rules about going down range, etc. All right? Now, I know that was a lot to say for something that's probably pretty basic for a lot of you, but I hope you got something out of it. I guarantee you that this version of the firearm safety rules will make it easier for you to abide by them more consistently, and also for you to teach them to, people who are now being introduced to firearms. All right? I'll see you next time.